Colonial America. Hey there, history buffs and curious minds. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of Colonial America. Buckle up, because we're about to embark on an epic journey through time, exploring the birth of a nation and the incredible stories of those who shaped it. So, grab your favorite snack, get comfy, and let's get started. Chapter 1. Picture this. It's the late 15th century, and Europe is buzzing with excitement. The age of exploration is in full swing, and brave, or maybe just crazy, adventurers are setting sail across the vast Atlantic Ocean, searching for new lands and untold riches. Little did they know that their voyages would set the stage for one of the most significant chapters in world history. Now you might be wondering, what's the big deal? Wasn't America already there? Well, yes and no. The land we now call America had been home to diverse indigenous peoples for thousands of years. But for Europeans, this was a whole new world, ripe for exploration and, unfortunately, exploitation. The first major player in our story is none other than Christopher Columbus. In 1492, he sailed the ocean blue, thinking he'd found a new route to Asia. Spoiler alert, he didn't. But his voyages kicked off a frenzy of exploration that would change the course of history. Fast forward a bit, and we've got other European powers joining the party. The Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English were all eager to claim a piece of the New World pie. But for our story today, we're going to focus on the English colonies that would eventually become the United States. Chapter 2. The First English Settlements. All right, let's set the scene. It's 1607, and a group of English adventurers are about to make history. They've just landed on the shores of what will become Virginia, and they're ready to establish the first permanent English settlement in North America, Jamestown. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Life in Jamestown was tough. These early settlers faced a perfect storm of challenges: harsh weather, unfamiliar diseases, conflicts with local Native American tribes, and a severe lack of survival skills. It's like they were playing a real-life version of Oregon Trail, but with the difficulty set to nightmare mode. Despite the odds, Jamestown managed to hang on by its fingernails. The colonists got a much-needed boost when they started cultivating tobacco, which quickly became a valuable cash crop. But let's not forget the dark side of this economic success. It also led to the introduction of slavery in the colonies, a tragic legacy that would shape American history for centuries to come. While Jamestown was struggling to survive in the South, another group of English settlers was gearing up for their own American adventure. In 1620, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, carrying a group of religious dissenters known as the Pilgrims. Their destination? The wild shores of Massachusetts. The Pilgrim's story is one we've all heard, usually accompanied by images of fancy buckle hats and turkey dinners. But the reality was far less glamorous. Like their Jamestown counterparts, the Pilgrims faced a brutal first winter. Many didn't survive. But with the help of local Native Americans, particularly Squanto and Massasoit, the Plymouth colonists managed to adapt and eventually thrive. Chapter 3. The Colonial Mosaic. Now, here's where things get really interesting. As word spread back in England about these new settlements, more and more people started packing their bags for America. But not everyone came for the same reasons. In New England, many settlers were Puritans seeking religious freedom. They established colonies like Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. These folks were big on education and established some of America's oldest universities, like Harvard in 1636. Talk about early college prep. Meanwhile, in the middle colonies, places like New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, a different vibe was emerging. These areas became known for their diversity, attracting settlers from various European countries and religious backgrounds. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, was particularly welcoming to different faiths and became a haven for Quakers. Down in the southern colonies, including Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, life revolved around large plantations. The warm climate and fertile soil were perfect for growing cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. But this agricultural success came at a terrible human cost, as the demand for labor led to an increased reliance on enslaved Africans. It's important to note that while we often talk about the 13 colonies as if they were a unified group, the reality was much more complex. Each colony had its own unique character, government, and economy. It was less like 13 siblings and more like 13 distant cousins who occasionally got together for awkward family reunions. Chapter 4: Colonial Life: The Good, the Bad, and the Smelly. So, what was life actually like for these colonial Americans? Well, it depended a lot on who you were and where you lived. But let's try to paint a general picture. First off, forget about your modern comforts. No smartphones, no Netflix, not even indoor plumbing. Life in colonial America was all about hard work and survival. Most people were farmers, spending their days tending crops, caring for livestock, and trying not to die from various diseases or accidents. Fun times, right? In the cities, which were starting to grow, you might find craftsmen, merchants, and professionals like lawyers and doctors. But don't get too excited about that last one. Colonial medicine was, let's just say it was an experience. Got a headache? How about some bloodletting? Feeling under the weather? Here, smoke this tobacco, it's good for you. Education was valued, especially in New England, but it wasn't universal. Many children, particularly girls and enslaved individuals, had limited access to formal schooling. Instead, they learned practical skills at home or through apprenticeships. Religion played a huge role in colonial life. In New England, the Puritan work ethic and strict moral code shaped society. Sunday church services were a big deal, often lasting for hours. And if you misbehaved, you might find yourself in the stocks or wearing a scarlet letter. Talk about tough love. But it wasn't all work and no play. Colonists did find time for some fun. Taverns were popular gathering spots where people could drink, gossip, and maybe start a revolution or two. More on that later. They also enjoyed sports like wrestling and various ball games. And let's not forget about those colonial dances. Nothing says party like it's 1699, like a good old-fashioned square dance. Chapter 5: The Native American Perspective. Now, we can't talk about colonial America without addressing the elephant in the room: the impact of European settlement on the indigenous peoples who had called this land home for thousands of years. When the first English colonists arrived, they encountered a diverse array of Native American cultures, each with their own languages, traditions, and ways of life. Some of the major groups in the eastern part of North America included the Wampanoag, Narragansett, Mohawk, Cherokee, and Powhatan, among many others. Initially, relations between Native Americans and colonists were often characterized by a mix of curiosity, trade, and mutual assistance. We've all heard the story of Squanto helping the Pilgrims survive their first winter. And in many cases, Native Americans played crucial roles in teaching the colonists how to cultivate local crops and navigate the unfamiliar terrain. But as more and more Europeans arrived and colonial settlements expanded, tensions began to rise. Conflicts over land, resources, and cultural misunderstandings led to increasingly hostile relations. The introduction of European diseases, against which Native Americans had no immunity, also had devastating effects on indigenous populations. One of the most significant conflicts of this period was King Philip's War, 1675-1678, named after the Wampanoag leader Metacom, whom the English called King Philip. This war, which spread across New England, was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to the size of the population. It resulted in significant losses for both sides and forever altered the balance of power in the region. As colonial powers consolidated their control, many Native American tribes were forced to adapt to new realities. Some chose to ally themselves with European powers, playing them against each other in an attempt to maintain their independence. Others were forced to relocate, often to less desirable lands, as colonial expansion pushed westward. The story of Native Americans in colonial America is complex and often tragic. It's a reminder that the founding of the United States came at a great cost to the indigenous peoples who had long called this land home. Chapter 6. The Growth of Slavery. Now, we need to talk about one of the darkest aspects of colonial America, the institution of slavery. It's a difficult topic, but it's crucial to understanding this period of history and its lasting impact on American society. Slavery in what would become the United States began in 1619 when a Dutch ship brought 20 enslaved Africans to Jamestown, Virginia. Initially, some Africans in the colonies were treated as indentured servants who could gain their freedom after a period of time. However, by the mid-17th century, slavery had become a hereditary, lifelong status for Africans and their descendants. The growth of slavery was closely tied to the economic development of the colonies, particularly in the South. As labor-intensive crops like tobacco, rice, and later cotton became increasingly profitable, the demand for enslaved workers grew. By the 18th century, the transatlantic slave trade was bringing thousands of enslaved Africans to American shores each year. Life for enslaved individuals in colonial America was brutal and dehumanizing. They were treated as property, subjected to harsh working conditions, separated from their families, and denied basic rights and freedoms. The legal system in the colonies gradually codified racial slavery, creating a society where skin color determined one's status and opportunities. It's important to note that while slavery became most entrenched in the southern colonies, it existed throughout colonial America. Even in New England, where slavery was less economically central, many wealthy families owned enslaved individuals as domestic servants. The institution of slavery had profound effects on colonial society, shaping everything from economic structures to social hierarchies. It also led to the development of racist ideologies that were used to justify the enslavement of Africans and their descendants. Despite the oppressive system, enslaved individuals resisted in various ways. Some attempted to escape, like Frederick Douglass would famously do in the 19th century. Others practiced forms of cultural resistance, maintaining African traditions and creating new cultural forms that would greatly influence American culture. The legacy of slavery would continue to shape American history long after the colonial period, leading to the Civil War and ongoing struggles for racial equality that continue to this day. Chapter 7. The Great Awakening. All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a phenomenon that shook up colonial society in the mid-18th century, the Great Awakening. No, this wasn't some colonial version of a zombie apocalypse. It was a religious revival that swept through the American colonies from the 1730s to the 1740s. Picture this. You're living in a colonial town, going about your daily life, when suddenly a charismatic preacher rolls into town. He's not like your usual minister. This guy's passionate, emotional, and he's drawing crowds like you wouldn't believe. That's the Great Awakening in a nutshell. Key figures in this movement included Jonathan Edwards, famous for his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon, talk about a catchy title, and George Whitefield, a British preacher who became a colonial celebrity. These guys were like the rock stars of their day, traveling from town to town and delivering fiery sermons that got people all fired up about religion. The Great Awakening emphasized personal, emotional religious experiences over dry intellectual approaches to faith. It encouraged people to have a direct relationship with God, rather than relying solely on established church hierarchies. This was pretty revolutionary stuff for the time. But the Great Awakening wasn't just about religion. It had some pretty significant social and political impacts too. For one, it helped break down some of the barriers between different Protestant denominations. It also promoted literacy, as people were encouraged to read the Bible for themselves. Perhaps most importantly, The Great Awakening helped foster a sense of shared American identity. As people from different colonies came together to hear these popular preachers, they began to see themselves as part of a larger community. Some historians even argue that this laid some of the groundwork for the American Revolution. Who knew a religious revival could be so politically charged? Chapter 8. Colonial Politics and Government. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of colonial politics. Spoiler alert, it's not all powdered wigs and fancy tea parties, though there's definitely some of that. First things first, we need to understand that the colonies weren't one big happy family under British rule. Each colony had its own government structure, and they often had about as much in common with each other as a lobster has with a prairie dog. At the top of the colonial power structure was the British monarchy and parliament. They made the big decisions like declaring wars and regulating trade, but day-to-day governance was largely left to the colonial governments. Most colonies had a similar basic structure: a governor appointed by the British Crown, except in Rhode Island and Connecticut, where they got to elect their own. A council usually appointed by the governor and elected assembly. Now, here's where it gets interesting. These colonial assemblies started flexing their muscles pretty early on. They realized that they held the purse strings. They could approve or deny funding for the governor's salary and other expenses. This gave them a fair bit of leverage in colonial politics. But who got to vote for these assemblies? Well, that depended on the colony. But generally, you had to be a free, adult, property-owning male. Sorry, ladies, and anyone who wasn't white or wealthy. Democracy was still a work in progress. One of the key political concepts that developed during this time was the idea of salutary neglect. Basically, for much of the early 18th century, Britain took a hands-off approach to governing the colonies. As long as the colonies remained loyal and trade kept flowing, the British were content to let them manage their own affairs. This period of salutary neglect allowed the colonies to develop a taste for self-government. They got used to making their own decisions and managing their own affairs. Little did Britain know, they were essentially giving the colonies a crash course in Independence 101. But all good things must come to an end, and salutary neglect was no exception. After the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, Britain decided it was time to tighten the reins on the colonies. And boy, did that not go over well. Chapter 9. The French and Indian War. All right, history fans, it's time to talk about the French and Indian War. Despite its name, this wasn't just a conflict between the French and Native Americans. Nope, this was a full-blown international showdown that would reshape the map of North America and set the stage for the American Revolution. The French and Indian War was actually part of a larger global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. It pit Britain and its colonial allies against France and its Native American allies. The main prize? Control over North America. The war kicked off in 1754 when a young George Washington, yes, that George Washington, led a group of Virginia militiamen into a skirmish with French forces in the Ohio River Valley. Talk about starting your military career with a bang. For the next 9 years, battles raged across North America. The British and their colonists fought against the French and their Native American allies. It was a brutal conflict, with both sides using tactics that would be considered war crimes today. One of the most famous events of the war was the British capture of Quebec in 1759. Led by General James Wolfe, British forces scaled the cliffs outside the city and surprised the French in a battle on the Plains of Abraham. Both Wolfe and the French commander, Montcalm, died in the battle. But the British victory marked a turning point in the war. By 1763, it was all over. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the conflict, and France was forced to give up nearly all its North American territories. Britain now controlled a vast empire, stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. So, Britain won big time, right? Well, yes. But this victory came with some pretty major consequences. Britain was now saddled with a mountain of debt from the war. They had to figure out how to govern a huge new territory. including a large French-speaking population in Quebec. Many Native American tribes, angry at British expansion, launched a series of attacks known as Pontiac's Rebellion. The colonies, having fought alongside British troops, had a new sense of their own military capabilities and importance. To deal with these issues, Britain decided to end its policy of salutary neglect and take a more active role in governing the colonies. They started by trying to restrict colonial expansion west of the Appalachian Mountains with the Proclamation Line of 1763. The goal was to prevent conflicts with Native Americans, but many colonists saw it as an infringement on their rights. Little did King George III know, but his efforts to tighten control over the colonies would backfire spectacularly. The stage was set for a showdown between Britain and its increasingly restless American colonies. Chapter 10: The Road to Revolution continued. First up, we've got the Sugar Act of 1764. Now, the British government was looking at its war debt and thinking, hey, maybe the colonies should help pay for this. So they slapped a tax on sugar and molasses. The colonists were not amused. They started grumbling about taxation without representation, a phrase you're going to hear a lot in the coming years. But if the Sugar Act was the appetizer of colonial discontent, the Stamp Act of 1765 was the main course. This act required colonists to pay a tax on pretty much every piece of paper they used. Legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. The colonists went from grumbling to full-on protesting. They formed groups like the Sons of Liberty, boycotted British goods, and even got a bit rowdy with some tar and feathering. In response to the uproar, Britain repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but they also passed the Declaratory Act, which basically said, we can tax you whenever we want, deal with it. Spoiler alert, the colonists did not, in fact, deal with it. Next up, we've got the Townshend Acts of 1767. These put taxes on a bunch of imported goods like glass, paint, and tea. The colonists responded with more boycotts and protests. Things really heated up in Boston, where tensions between colonists and British soldiers led to the Boston Massacre in 1770. Despite its name, only 5 colonists died, but it became a rallying cry for anti-British sentiment. In 1773, we get to one of the most famous events of the pre-revolutionary period, the Boston Tea Party. The British East India Company was struggling, so Parliament gave them a sweetheart deal to sell tea in the colonies. The colonists saw this as another attempt to force them to accept British taxation. So what did they do? They dressed up as Native Americans, boarded some ships in Boston Harbor, and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. Talk about a waste of a good cuppa. The British response to this tea-tastic rebellion was a series of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These closed Boston Harbor, restricted town meetings, and gave the British more control over the Massachusetts government. Instead of cowing the colonists into submission, these acts united them in opposition to British rule. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They didn't call for independence yet, but they did agree to boycott British goods and prepared for the possibility of war. By April 1775, that possibility became a reality. British troops marched to Concord, Massachusetts, to seize colonial weapons. Paul Revere and others rode out to warn the colonists, and on April 19th, the shot heard round the world was fired on Lexington Green. The American Revolution had begun. Chapter 11: Colonial Culture and Society. Before we wrap up our colonial journey, let's take a step back and look at what life was like for everyday colonists. What did they eat? What did they wear? What did they do for fun? Spoiler: it wasn't scrolling through TikTok. First off, let's talk fashion. Colonial clothing varied based on social class, but in general, think layers. Lots of layers. Men typically wore breeches, kind of like knee-length pants, stockings, a shirt, a waistcoat, and a coat. Women wore long dresses with petticoats and stays, a type of corset. And everyone loved a good hat. The fancier your clothes, the higher your social status. When it came to food, colonial diets were heavily influenced by what could be grown or raised locally. Corn was a staple crop, used in everything from bread to puddings. Meat was popular, especially pork and beef. In coastal areas, fish and shellfish were common. And let's not forget about alcohol. Beer and cider were everyday drinks, often safer to consume than water. Education in the colonies varied widely. In New England, towns were required to provide basic education, leading to high literacy rates. In the middle and southern colonies, education was more informal and often limited to wealthy families who could afford private tutors. Harvard College, founded in 1636, was the first institution of higher learning in the colonies. For entertainment, colonists enjoyed a variety of activities. They played games like nine pins, a precursor to bowling, and card games. Music was popular, with fiddles and flutes being common instruments. Dancing was also a favorite pastime, especially at social gatherings. And of course, there were always taverns for those looking to enjoy a drink and some gossip. Religion played a huge role in colonial life, particularly in New England, where Puritanism held sway. Sunday church services were a central part of the week, often lasting for hours. However, religious diversity increased over time, especially in the middle colonies where groups like the Quakers found refuge. Art in the colonies was primarily functional rather than decorative. Portraiture was popular among the wealthy, while everyday items like furniture and household goods often featured decorative elements. Architecture ranged from simple log cabins on the frontier to grand Georgian-style homes for the elite. Literature in the colonies was heavily influenced by religious and practical concerns. Sermons, almanacs, and instructional texts were common. However, by the mid-18th century, newspapers became increasingly important, helping to spread ideas and unite the colonies. One aspect of colonial culture that's often overlooked is the influence of enslaved Africans. Despite the brutality of slavery, enslaved individuals maintained and adapted their cultural traditions, influencing American music, dance, food, and language in ways that are still felt today. Chapter 12. Legacy of Colonial America. As we wrap up our journey through colonial America, let's take a moment to reflect on the lasting impact of this period on American history and culture. First and foremost, the colonial period laid the groundwork for American democracy. The tradition of representative government, established in colonial assemblies, would evolve into the system of government we have today. The colonial experience of self-governance during the period of salutary neglect fostered a spirit of independence that would ultimately lead to the American Revolution. The religious diversity of the colonies, particularly in Pennsylvania and other middle colonies, set a precedent for religious freedom that would be enshrined in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. At the same time, the Protestant work ethic that characterized many colonial communities continues to influence American attitudes toward work and success. Economically, the colonial period established patterns that would shape American development for centuries. The plantation system of the South, built on slave labor, would have profound and tragic consequences that the nation is still grappling with today. The mercantile traditions of New England and the middle colonies laid the foundation for American capitalism. The colonial experience also shaped America's relationship with the wider world. The colonies' role in the British Empire gave them a global perspective from the start, and the networks of trade established during this period set the stage for America's future as a commercial powerhouse. The interaction between European settlers and Native Americans during the colonial period had devastating consequences for indigenous peoples, leading to widespread displacement and cultural disruption. This difficult legacy continues to influence U.S. policy and social issues related to Native American rights and sovereignty. The institution of slavery, entrenched during the colonial period, would leave an indelible mark on American society. Its effects would lead to the Civil War and continue to shape issues of race and equality in the United States to this day. On a cultural level, many aspects of colonial life have become part of America's national mythology. From the Pilgrim's First Thanksgiving to Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, stories from the colonial era continue to be retold and reinterpreted, shaping how Americans understand their national identity. Even the geography of the United States bears the imprint of the colonial era. The boundaries of many eastern states reflect colonial borders, and numerous cities founded during this period, like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, remain major urban centers today. In many ways, to understand colonial America is to understand the roots of the United States. The political ideals, economic systems, social structures, and cultural patterns established during this period have evolved over time, but their influence can still be felt in modern American life. As we look back on this formative period in American history, it's important to recognize both its achievements and its failings. The story of colonial America is one of courage and perseverance, of high ideals and profound injustices. It's a complex legacy that continues to shape the United States and its place in the world. Conclusion, and there you have it, folks. A whirlwind tour through colonial America. We've covered a lot of ground, from the first tentative settlements at Jamestown and Plymouth to the eve of the American Revolution. We've seen how a scattered collection of colonies on the edge of the known world grew into a unique society, laying the groundwork for a new nation. Along the way, we've encountered a cast of characters that could rival any Hollywood blockbuster. Brave explorers, determined settlers, charismatic preachers, savvy politicians, and ordinary people just trying to make a life for themselves in a new world. We've seen moments of cooperation and conflict, triumphs and tragedies, all of which played a part in shaping what would become the United States. As we've discovered, colonial America was far from perfect. The displacement of Native Americans, the horrors of slavery, religious intolerance, and political conflicts all cast long shadows over this period. Yet at the same time, we can see the seeds of ideas and institutions that would flourish in the centuries to come. Concepts like self-government, religious freedom, and economic opportunity that would become central to the American experience. The story of colonial America is, in many ways, the first chapter in the larger story of the United States. It's a reminder that nations aren't born fully formed, but are shaped by the experiences, decisions, and struggles of those who came before. As we face our own challenges in the present day, perhaps we can draw inspiration from the resilience and determination of those colonial Americans who faced an uncertain future with courage and hope. So the next time you sip a cup of tea, hopefully not in Boston Harbor, or pass by a colonial-era building or debate politics with your friends, remember, you're part of a story that began long ago, in those early days of colonial America. It's a story that's still being written, with each of us playing our own small part in shaping the next chapter of American history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Until our next historical adventure, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep making history.